there. If you've just seen the title to this video and come in here expecting an in-depth analysis of Jordan Peterson's overarching arguments or ideologies, I'm afraid to say that you will be disappointed, because that's not what I'm doing today. Maybe in the future it is something I've been considering doing, but it's been done so much and so often by so many other much more talented people that I'm hesitant to just bash one out without giving it some serious thought. Actually, that was a very poor choice of words. However, I've been having more and more arguments on the internet about this one psychology professor that I had to do something. Incidentally, you should have realised by now, by the amount of times I talk about fights I have on the internet, that I'm not someone you want in your Facebook comment section. Anyway, I recently saw this tweet by famed white nationalist and extremely punchable man Richard Spencer, and it didn't exactly shock me, but it did really hit home for me the extent to which conservatives and more far-right figures are able to unite in a way that the left struggles to do, despite any ideological differences they might have, as I discussed in my Turfs and Swerfs video. This is an apparently more moderate right-wing figure who mainly writes self-help books for incels, who is hailed by the right as the voice of reason and shares a number of ideological positions with literal neo-fucking Nazis. Of course, as I'm sure we're all aware, Peterson rose to prominence after getting all pissy about pronouns, as all rational skeptics do nowadays, as the discussion over whether or not there is a god has been conclusively settled on the internet.
Potato!
And has a number of questionable opinions on a number of matters relating to politics and gender, both of which are arguably far outside his area of expertise, and it would be remiss of me not to at least attempt to refute some of his points. So I did what I believed was the reasonable thing to do. I asked some Jordan Peterson fans to provide me with an example of him demonstrating the rationality and reasoned arguments he's apparently so beloved for, rather than spouting far-right dog whistles and talking points, and after I was done watching several videos with titles like "Jordan Peterson destroys libtard college student" in all caps, I finally came across this video. Probably the quintessential Peterson video, the infamous Channel 4 interview, from which a majority of memes about him originate, including that fucking lobster shit. So I decided to make something I wish I'd have had when I had internet smack fights about this fucking guy in the past. I'm going to go through this video and tear his arguments to fucking shreds, because if I had to watch half an hour of an ignorant wanker with the most irritatingly quavering voice in the fucking world prattling on about shit he clearly doesn't understand, I'm going to at least make it productive. Let's, as bourgeois scum Philip DeFranco would say, jump right into it. Okay, so he starts off with this idea that masculinity is a tangible, quantifiable thing when it demonstrably is not.
Jordan Peterson, you've said that men need to, quote, grow the hell up. Tell me why.
Well, because there's nothing uglier than an old infant. There's nothing good about it. People who don't grow up don't find the sort of meaning in their life that sustains them through difficult times, and they are certain to encounter difficult times. And they're left bitter and resentful and without purpose and adrift and hostile and resentful and vengeful and arrogant and deceitful and of no use to themselves and of no use to anyone else and no partner for a woman, and there's nothing in it that's good.
So you say, I mean, that sounds pretty bad. You're saying
It's
there's a
bad.
crisis of masculinity? I mean, what do you do about it?
I guess we could argue back and forth about gender roles, or society's expectations of people of different genders, or even the history of gender and how it relates to sex, like, for example, ancient cultures which acknowledged and accepted the existence of non-binary, trans, or gender non-conforming people. But I think at this point that we're all aware that gender is purely socially constructed, whether or not you think that's a good thing, and can be expressed in a number of different ways. Like, I'm a cis man, and I demonstrate my gender in different ways than, for example, this guy, but we are both male, and there's not exactly a clearly defined system for measuring masculinity or femininity other than this person fits in my arbitrary preconceived notions of what gender is. He is correct that we do not treat men and women the same, and that we often do not give men words of encouragement, as he puts it.
Oh, God, all sorts of things have gone wrong. I don't think that young men hear words of encouragement. Some of them never in their entire lives, as far as I can tell. That's what they tell me. And the fact that the words that I've been speaking, the YouTube lectures that I've done and put online, for example, have had such a dramatic impact is an indication that young men are starving for this sort of message, because, like, why in the world would they have to derive it from a lecture on YouTube?
But I would argue that this is due to patriarchy and toxic masculinity over anything else. After all, who is it that shames men for not conforming to an extremely rigid set of expectations? And conversely, who is it that constantly points that out and fights against these expectations? Certainly not Peterson's fanbase, I can tell you that right now with a relative degree of certainty.
You help people understand why it's necessary and important for them to grow up and adopt responsibility. Why that isn't a shake your finger and get your act together sort of thing. Why it's more like a delineation of the kind of destiny that makes life worth living. I've been telling young men, but it's not, I wasn't specifically aiming this message at young men to begin with. It just kind of turned out that way.
And it's mostly, you admit, it's mostly men listening. I mean,
it
90% of your audiences are male,
well, it's
right?
about 80% on YouTube, which is YouTube is a male domain primarily. So it's hard to tell how much of it is because YouTube is male and how much of it is because of what I'm saying.
I don't know the metrics on YouTube being primarily male, but most people I know, regardless of gender, use YouTube in some capacity, so it sounds a little bit like bullshit. I have noticed that in the analytics, the percentages seem to be heavily skewed towards male audiences. Of course, this doesn't take into account non-binary or trans people, though admittedly I doubt he has too many trans fans considering a lot of his rhetoric. I don't know, I just feel like YouTube is so ubiquitous at this point that saying YouTube is primarily male is like saying Facebook is primarily female. Hang on, let me check it out. Okay, back now. It turns out that YouTube users are basically 50-50, although once again the binary nature of YouTube's method of categorizing people is something that not only pisses me off, but is also not an accurate or helpful method of doing so. But men watch a shit ton of gaming content which skews the view numbers in their favour.
Does it bother you that your audience is predominantly male? Isn't that a bit divisive?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's no more divisive than the fact that YouTube is primarily male and Tumblr is primarily female.
Isn't it?
Tumblr is primarily female.
But you're just saying that's the way it is.
Well, I'm not saying anything. It's just an observation that that's the way it is. There's plenty of women that are watching my lectures and coming to my talks and buying my books. It's just that the majority of them happen to be men.
This video was posted in January this year. Assuming that's when the interview took place, I kind of have to ask why it thinks any significant amount of people use Tumblr nowadays. Obviously, this was before Tumblr banned all its adult content, so now even less people use it. But even back then, it was hardly the powerhouse it once was. I remember a time when everyone had a Tumblr blog. This men are babies thing is confusing.
What's in it for the women, though?
Well, what sort of partner do you want? You want an overgrown child?
What constitutes an adult to him? He complains about this but doesn't define the specificities of the problem. Does it mean responsibility? Emotional maturity? You have to define a problem before you can solve it, Dr. Peterson.
No, I mean, it's exactly how I laid it out. Like, women deeply want men who are competent and powerful.
Women want men who are competent and powerful. What the fuck kind of Tyler Durden bullshit is this? I'm starting to think that Peterson hates not only non-binary genders, but anything that doesn't easily fit into any binary. Women value different things in different people. I really don't think that this should be as controversial a statement as it apparently is. Some women are into the hypermasculine ideal, some value other characteristics. I somehow managed to have a sex life, so clearly the hypermasculine route is not the only viable one. Is this really an enormous revelation to anyone watching this? I know it's an incel thing that women only want chads or whatever, but this guy is supposed to be the incel savior, right? The great deprogrammer. How is pandering to their ideals achieving that?
And I don't mean power in that they can exert tyrannical control over others. That's not power. That's just corruption. Power is competence.
Apparently power means competence, so women want competence and competence.
And why in the world would you not want a competent partner? Well, I know why, actually. You can't dominate a compered partner. So if you want domination...
want to dominate, is that what you're saying?
No, I'd say women who have had their relationships their relationships with men impaired and who are afraid of such relationships will settle for a weak partner because they can dominate them. But it's a suboptimal solution.
Do you think that's what a lot of women are doing?
I think there's a substantial minority of women who do that. And I think it's very bad for them. They're very unhappy. It's very bad for their partners, although the partners get the advantage of not having to take any responsibility.
But what gives you the right to say that? I mean, maybe that's how women want their relationships, those women. I mean, you're making these vast generalizations.
I'm a clinical psychologist.
Right, so you're saying you've done your research and women are unhappy dominating men.
I didn't say they were unhappy dominating men. I said it was a bad long-term solution.
Okay, you said it was making them miserable.
Thing. Yes, it is. And it depends on the time frame. I mean, there's intense pleasure in momentary domination. That's why people do it all the time. But it's no formula for a successful long-term relationship. That's reciprocal, right? Any long-term relationship is reciprocal, virtually by definition.
So Peterson believes that women are damaged by bad relationships and want to dominate men, but are unhappy in the long run because of it. That seems a little Freudian, not gonna lie. Also, if one partner is always dominant according to him, why does it make a difference whether it's the man or the woman? I'm a pretty chill guy most of the time when I'm not talking about politics or Star Wars. The next Star Wars video is coming soon, I promise. So why should it bother me if my partner is more aggressive and assertive than me? Why should it bother her? In gay relationships, are both men hyper-aggressive towards one another and constantly butt heads, and lesbians are both so shy and retiring that nothing ever gets done? Clearly incredibly heteronormative bollocks.
So
let me put a quote to you from the book, where you say there are whole disciplines in universities forthrightly hostile towards men. These are the areas of study dominated by the postmodern stroke neo-Marxist claim that Western culture in particular is an oppressive structure created by white men to dominate and exclude women.
Okay, here's my issue with the postmodern neo-Marxist thing. Other than it clearly being a repackaged version of the cultural Marxism literal Nazi conspiracy theory, it misunderstands both Marxism and postmodernism. I'm not going to go into detail here because it's already been covered extensively elsewhere, but in short, many Marxists are opposed to postmodernist philosophy and vice versa, including John Molyneux of the Socialist Workers' Party, who described it as singing an old song long intoned by bourgeois historians of various persuasions. Obviously, both Marxism and postmodernism come in all stripes, and can in theory intersect at some points, but Peterson uses the term to refer to both, individually and together, essentially trying to rehabilitate the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory by rebranding it, much like neo-Nazis and white nationalists prefer to call themselves race realists, or the alt-right now, and have rebranded their own white genocide conspiracy theory as the Great Replacement. It's something I'm honestly jealous of, to be honest. We're still here using terms like dialectic, syndicalist, and bourgeoisie, whereas by now the right have redefined themselves and changed their terms 50 times in that same time frame.
Why should women be content
I'm not
not
saying
to
that
get
they
to the
should
top?
put up with it. I'm saying that the claim that the wage gap between men and women is only due to sex is wrong. And it is wrong. There's no doubt about that. The multivariate analysis have been done. So I can give you an example.
You keep on talking about multivariate analysis.
Let me give you an example.
I'm saying that 9% pay gap exists.
Yeah.
That's a gap between men and women. I'm not saying why it exists, but it exists. Now, if you're a woman, that seems pretty unfair.
You have to say why it exists.
But do you agree that it's unfair? If you're a woman...
Not necessarily.
And on average, you're getting paid 9% less than a man. That's not fair, is it?
It depends on why it's happening. I can give you an example. Okay. There's a personality trait known as agreeableness. Agreeable people are compassionate and polite. And agreeable people get paid less than less agreeable people for the same job. Women are more agreeable than men.
Oh, the gender pay gap stuff. This is standard anti-feminist rhetoric at this point, to be honest. I could go through each individual point of his argument and pull it apart, but the simple fact is that it could be much more effectively refuted by simply pointing out that everything claimed as a reason for the gender pay gap can be attributed to patriarchy. Agreeableness, or lack of aggression, for example, ignoring for a moment that he literally just said that women being aggressive and dominant is bad and will in the long term make them unhappy and cause society to collapse, can be attributed to our society pushing men to be aggressive and women to be demure due to toxic gender norms.
Well, or choosing careers that actually happen to be paid less, which women do a lot of.
Women choose careers that pay less is a disingenuous statement. No one chooses to take a low-paid job. Millions of people have low-paid jobs, and I don't think any of us really thought, fuck it, I really love being broke. No, the reason that women's jobs are often paid less is due to a mixture of female-dominated fields like care, nursing, etc. being incredibly undervalued, and more male-dominated fields being exclusionary to most women. For a more in-depth look at this from me, click the thing.
I would say that many women around the age of, I would say between 28 and 32, have a career family crisis that they have to deal with.
The career versus family crisis is due to a mixture of capitalism and patriarchy. We shouldn't have to choose between struggling to survive but getting to watch your kids grow up, or having enough money to get by but having to be separated from your kids the majority of the time, and yet here we are. The only people who can have both nowadays are the rich. And the reason a lot of women have this crisis, and most men do not, is because of these unhealthy attitudes towards gender that Peterson is helping to perpetuate, which makes clear assumptions that women should be the ones to stay home and raise kids, whereas men should be the breadwinners.
And I think that's partly because of the foreshortened time frame that women have to contend with. Like, women have to get the major pieces of their life put together faster than men, which is also partly why men aren't under so much pressure to grow up. So because for the typical woman, she has to have her career and family in order pretty much by the time she's 35.
Peterson clearly does not know many working class people if he thinks the majority of women have a career and a family by 35 nowadays. In most Western countries, the birth rate is dropping off at an actively concerning rate because, well, who wants to bring kids into the world at this point? Apparently the world's going to end in the next 15 years due to climate change, babies cost money most people do not have, and honestly, who wants to subject a poor, unsuspecting child to the late capitalist hellscape the world already is? Not to mention how their adult life will turn out once we've irreversibly fucked up the environment.
Fairly, we could get to a point where people were treated fairly or more fairly. I mean, people are treated pretty fairly in Western culture already.
People are treated fairly in Western culture already. What the fuck is he basing that on? A comparison to the third world, which is entirely due to capitalism? This guy clearly lives in a bubble because he's saying this in the UK, where over 100,000 children are facing Christmas reliant on food banks to survive, while corporations throw out tons and tons of food, and our current food production is more than enough to feed everyone currently alive and more.
Why would there still be a pay gap, which we've discussed at length? Why are women at the BBC saying that they're getting paid illegally less than men to do the same job? Well, that's not fair, is it?
Let's go to the first question. Those are complicated questions. Seven women, repeat that one.
There's 7 women running the top FTSE 100 companies in the UK.
Okay. Well, the first question might be, why would you want to do that?
Why would a man want to do it? I mean, there's a lot of money, it's an interesting job.
There's a certain number of men, although not that many, who are perfectly willing to sacrifice virtually all of their life to the pursuit of a high-end career. So they'll work. These are men that are very intelligent. They're usually very, very conscientious. They're very driven. They're very high energy. They're very healthy. And they're willing to work 70 or 80 hours a week, non-stop, specialized at one thing to get to the top.
I'm not a huge fan of the neoliberal feminist not enough female CEOs argument the presenter keeps using, but Peterson just utterly fails to answer this to my satisfaction. The Good Doctor says that men are willing to make sacrifices but women are not, based on... Also, he clearly ignores the many, many jobs in which women do work ridiculous hours doing hard jobs because they are undervalued and not highly paid, as I just mentioned. He goes on about Scandinavia.
That doesn't mean they can't be treated fairly.
Is gender equality desirable?
If it means equality of outcome, then almost certainly it's undesirable. That's already been demonstrated in Scandinavia.
Not mentioning any specific countries, but sure, whatever, Iceland and Sweden are identical, okay then.
Well, men and women won't sort themselves into the same categories if you leave them alone to do it of their own accord. We've already seen that in Scandinavia. It's 20 to 1 female nurses to male, something like that. It might not be quite that extreme, and approximately the same male engineers to female engineers. And that's a consequence of the free choice of men and women in the societies that have gone farther than any other societies to make gender equality the purpose of the law.
And says that proves that gender equality is impossible because they have strict gender laws. The problem is that gender binarism is not due to law, but society and culture. If we legislate that men and women should be paid the same, but don't do anything to change the fact that our society is set up in such a way as to push men and women towards different things via certain cultural norms, then of course nothing is going to change. If we continue to instill the idea that women are good at emotional labour and men are good at physical and intellectual labour into each future generation, then of course those little girls aren't going to have as much incentive to go into engineering or something until we stop imposing our preconceived notions about gender into kids, and as a result the wider population.
Let me put something else to you from the book. You say the introduction of the equal pay for equal work argument immediately complicates even salary comparison beyond practicality for one simple reason. Who decides what work is equal? It's not possible. So the simple question is, do you believe in equal pay?
Well, I made the argument there. It's like it depends on who defines it.
So you don't believe in equal pay?
Equal pay for equal work means that if you do the same job, you should be paid the same. Not that we should somehow define some kind of Marxist meritocratic wage system or labour vouchers, and to pretend otherwise is deliberate deceit or genuine ignorance.
Is it not desirable to have some of those female traits you're talking about? I'd say that's a generalisation, but you've used the words female traits. Is it not desirable to have some of them at the top of business? I mean, maybe there wouldn't have been a banking crisis.
They don't predict success in the workplace. The things that predict success in the workplace are intelligence and conscientiousness. Agreeableness negatively predicts success in the workplace.
Female traits do not predict success because we've decided that male traits are the ones that predict success. If aggression is the way to succeed and aggression is a male trait, then no fucking shit male traits predict success.
Not exactly rocket science, is it?
Also, is telling that success is implied to mean getting rich here. He talks about masculine traits but doesn't elaborate on why certain traits are masculine and some feminine. Presumably he can't believe it's entirely social or learned because that would contradict his entire position up to this point. So does he believe that traits we define as masculine and feminine are biological? Or does he just believe that we shouldn't criticize or examine them because society has decided that they are the way they are? Both are fascinating and horrifying in equal measure.
So I worked with women who worked in high-powered law firms in Canada for about 15 years, and they were as competent and put together as anybody you would ever meet. And we were trying to figure out how to further their careers. And there was a huge debate in Canadian society at that point that was basically ran along the same lines as your argument, is that if the law firms didn't use these masculine criteria, then perhaps women would do better. But the market sets the damn game.
Fuck right off. This presenter is being pretty aggressive and a little uncharitable, but she does make some good points in this section.
It's like...
And the market is dominated by men.
No, it's not. It's
You,
not. The market is dominated by women. They make 80% of the consumer decisions.
I'm not exactly sure what he means by the women control the market thing, to be honest. It's a little confusing. Men overwhelmingly dictate the market in terms of controlling the companies and means of production. Does it just mean women shop more? That's nothing to do with the topic at hand. Also, what the fuck?
No,
I mean, that's very dangerous territory.
I'm not saying that at all.
Are women less intelligent than men, by and large?
No, they're not. No, the data on that's pretty clear. The average IQ for a woman and the average IQ for a man is identical. There is some debate about the flatness of the distribution, which is something that James Damore pointed out, for example, in his memo, but there's no difference at all in general cognitive ability.
Just name-dropping the Google memo guy then. Okay, sure, let's just leave everything problematic he said and make pretend what he actually meant by stretching interpretations to breaking point, shall we?
Let me move on to another debate that's been very controversial for you. And this is, you got in trouble for refusing to call trans men and women by their preferred personal pronouns.
No, that's not actually true. I got in trouble because I said I would not follow the compelled speech dictates of the federal and provincial government. I actually never got in trouble for not calling anyone anything.
Right.
That didn't happen.
You wouldn't follow the change of law, which was designed
not
to
once
outlaw
it was law.
Discrimination.
No.
Okay, the trans stuff. I'm sorry, but fuck Peterson on this. Honestly, if someone says, please call me she or her, fucking do it. We have hate speech laws for other oppressed groups. It's really not a huge deal to do it for trans people as well. He doesn't call for an end to laws prohibiting racial hatred. I wonder why.
You cited freedom of speech in that. Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
They're taking away my freedom of speech, insists a man on national television who regularly goes around the world giving speeches.
A trans person in your class has come to your class and said they want to be called
That's never happened. And I would call them she.
So you would. So you've kind of changed your tune on that.
No, I said that right from the beginning. What I said at the beginning was that I was not going to cede the linguistic territory to radical leftists, regardless of whether or not it was put in law.
Okay, so he has no issue with using preferred pronouns, but he thinks that forcing him to do so is radical leftism. Ah, yes, I recall now, as Marx said in Das Kapital, we must force university professors to call transgender teens by their preferred pronouns. Or is that Kropotkin? I mix them up sometimes.
Well, except you've also called trans campaigners authoritarian, haven't you? I mean, isn't that grossly
Well, only in the broader context of my claims that radical leftist ideologues are authoritarian, which they are.
You're saying someone who's trying to work out their gender identity, who may well have struggled with that, had quite a tough time over the years.
With it, yeah.
You're comparing them with, you know, Chairman Mao, who saw the deaths of millions of people. Well, even if the activists, you know, they're trans people too. They have a right to say these things.
Yeah, but they don't have a right to speak for their whole community.
To compare them to Chairman Mao or, you know, Pinochet, Augusto Pinochet. I mean, you know, this is grossly insensitive.
I didn't compare them to Pinochet.
Well,
I did compare them to
He was an authoritarian.
He's a right-winger, though. I was comparing them to the left-wing totalitarians.
A hate speech law is not the same as Maoism, Jordan, for fuck's sake.
Okay. And I do believe they are left-wing totalitarians.
Under Mao, millions of people died.
Right.
I mean, there's no comparison between Mao and a trans activist, is there?
Why not?
Because trans activists aren't killing millions of people?
The philosophy that's guiding their utterances is the same philosophy.
The consequences are...
Not yet.
You're saying that trans activists
No.
could lead to the deaths of millions of people? What
No,
they're
I'm saying that the philosophy that drives their utterances is the same philosophy that already has driven us to the deaths of millions.
What the fuck? He thinks trans activists and Chairman Mao are the same. I heard about the comparing trans pronouns law to Stalinism thing, but I thought he was just using ridiculous hyperbole about his frozen peaches, but apparently he genuinely believes there is a serious comparison there. Even if we assume that all trans activists are left-wing, they're not. He's lumping all leftists from Stalinist and tankies through to anarchists into the same ideology. Hey, I can do that too. Peterson is right-wing, and so was Hitler. Therefore, anyone refusing to use preferred pronouns is literally Hitler. This guy can just fuck off.
Okay, tell us how that philosophy is in any way comparable.
Sure, that's no problem. The first thing is that the philosophy presumes that group identity is paramount. That's the fundamental philosophy that drove the Soviet Union and Maoist China. And it's the fundamental philosophy of the left-wing activists. It's identity politics. It doesn't matter who you are as an individual, it matters who you are in terms of your group identity.
The group identity thing could just as easily be applied to the far right. Like, white nationalists clearly have a shared group identity they value above all else, and of course right-wing ideology and nationalism go hand in hand, and if anything, national identity is often more specific than any other kind of identity politics. Identity politics isn't inherent to leftists. Yes, there are left-wingers who think it's important, myself included, but there are also leftists who reject it, and think that once we bring about communism, all that equality will just come about as a natural outgrowth of that, whereas people like me would argue that that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't try to improve the lives of people now. Sure, we should also work to bring about a socialist utopia, but that doesn't mean we have to stand around and ignore injustice in the capitalist nightmare we currently inhabit.
Tell us about the lobster.
Well, that's quite a segue. Well, the first chapter I have in my book is called Stand Up Straight with Your Shoulders Back. And it's an injunction to be combative, not least to further your career, let's say, but also to adopt a stance of ready engagement with the world and to reflect that in your posture. And the reason that I write about lobsters is because there's this idea that hierarchical structures are a sociological construct of the Western patriarchy. And that is so untrue that it's almost unbelievable. And I use the lobster as an example because the lobster, we divulged from lobsters in evolutionary history about 350 million years ago, common ancestor. And lobsters exist in hierarchies, and they have a nervous system attuned to the hierarchy. And that nervous system runs on serotonin, just like our nervous systems do. And the nervous system of the lobster and of the human being is so similar that antidepressants work on lobsters. And it's part of my attempt to demonstrate that the idea of hierarchy has absolutely nothing to do with sociocultural construction, which it doesn't.
Let me just get this straight. You're saying that we should organise our societies along the lines of the lobsters.
I'm saying that it's inevitable that there will be continuity in the way that animals and human beings organize their structures. It's absolutely inevitable. And there is 1/3 of a billion years of evolutionary history behind that. Right? That's so long that 1/3 of a billion years ago, there weren't even trees. It's a long time. You have a mechanism in your brain that runs on serotonin that's similar to the lobster mechanism that tracks your status. And the higher your status, the better your emotions are regulated. So as your serotonin levels increase, you feel more positive emotion and less negative emotion.
So you're saying, like the lobsters, we're hardwired as men and women to do certain things, to sort of run along tram lines, and there's nothing we can do about it.
No, I'm not saying there's nothing we can do about it, because it's like in a chess game, right? There's lots of things that you can do, although you can't break the rules of the chess game and continue to play chess. And your biological nature is somewhat like that, is it sets the rules of the game, but within those rules you have a lot of leeway. But the idea that, but one thing we can't do is say that hierarchical organization is a consequence of the capitalist patriarchy. It's like, that's patently absurd. It's wrong. It's not a matter of opinion. It's seriously wrong.
Hey, the lobster thing. He still says lobsters are like this and so are people, regardless of what his defenders might try to argue. Also, just because something is a certain way, that doesn't mean it should be that way. Sure, hierarchies have a place in the natural world, and maybe arguably in our past, but that doesn't mean they're a hard and fast rule, or that we should continue to use them after we've outgrown the use for them. Additionally, there are examples of community control over direct hierarchy in the animal kingdom as well, so using one example of a crude class system in the animal kingdom isn't anywhere close to being an effective argument for the universality of hierarchy. Capitalism is hierarchical, and as a result, almost every other aspect of our lives is hierarchical, because almost every area of our lives is defined and dominated by capitalism. Incidentally, this is why anarcho-capitalism is not a thing. If people were to reject hierarchy in every aspect of their lives, why would the workplace or the economy be any different? Your boss has so much more power over you in a much more tangible way than politicians do most of the time. Sure, politicians can fuck over entire groups of people, but your boss can fuck you over personally. That's a much clearer example of hierarchy than some fucker who represents my town in Parliament. There's no way to know without trying though, and I can't see the capitalists giving up power on the off chance that it'll work. Considering the way that capitalist countries have reacted in the past as successful socialist nations, this is not even up for debate. Lobster gets mad that some people say he's not qualified to talk about politics, and yet he is a professor of psychology. He's about as qualified as I am, being a film and English student, and less qualified than any undergraduate politics graduate. Feel free to use this video in future whenever someone posts that Peterson video online or uses any of his incredibly flimsy, dishonest arguments or talking points. Most of the time I like to not assume malice on the part of the people I've responded to. The Dom, for example, seems like a really nice guy, and I actually really enjoy a lot of his work. Like, the series about Scott Pilgrim he recently finished is great, and I would recommend it. Hank Green is someone I've been casually following since 2007, and whilst I think he's going about it the wrong way, is clearly passionate about helping people. And from what I've seen, Thor Skywalker seems like a guy who's wrong about Star Wars and ignorant of certain truths about gender politics and feminism, but not actively flirting with far-right ideology, at least to my knowledge. But with Peterson, it genuinely seems to come from a place of actual dishonesty. I hate to do this, but quite frankly, fuck Jordan Peterson. He's not just some guy in his bedroom making stupid, ranty videos about Daredevil while dressed as a complete tool, although he dabbles in that too. He's actively influencing a lot of minds with his misinformed, biased, offensive, and disgusting rhetoric. Not only that, but has been openly accepted by the mainstream media that other similarly misinformed figures online like Sargon of Akkad simply have not. I have heard many people defend him by arguing that he helps deprogram incels by giving them self-help tips like clean your room or the Dragon of Chaos will get you, and encouraging them to get out in the world and stop wallowing in self-pity, and that may indeed be true, but in order to do so he lends credence and legitimacy to a poisonous far-right ideology, and to take this full circle, does this so effectively that Richard Spencer believes he has enough in common with Peterson to think that engaging with him in a public forum would be beneficial to both. He wouldn't do so if he thought there was no overlap between their ideologies. This is nothing new. Spencer is good at spotting online personalities that can serve as an entry point to far-right ideologies, as he accurately did here. Fuck Jordan Peterson.
KKK, neo-Nazi.
Those people don't like me.
Are you like the hipster version of the neo-Nazi movement?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.